The Man at Our Door by Remus R3. This happened on New Year's Eve, day of 2019 to 2020. I was celebrating the end of another year at my house with 3 of my friends. My dad was out at a friend's party for New Year, and my younger sister was at a sleepover as well. We were in the living room waiting for the cookies we'd baked to be ready, eating the raw leftover cookie dough. Who cares about salmonella, right? Watching Netflix. Castlevania Season 2, if anyone cares. Being teenage girls with no cooking skills for anything but pastries. We had ordered a shit ton of pizza and fast food from the local pizza shop. So when someone knocked at the door, we originally thought nothing of it. I mumbled a comment about delivery people not knowing what a doorbell was, and got up, pausing the TV, and paid the delivery guy. I went back to my friends and we started to dig in, still watching the TV. And then, this is the moment I don't think I can forget. Everything was so vivid. The door to the living room was shut, and curtains closed. TV at near full volume. We were all intently focused on the season's final episode, either throwing comments out at the TV, or just sounds of surprise. This began just as the final fight of the season started. My best friend Allie had just shouted, "He can turn into a fucking wolf!" At the same time, an aggressive bang came to the door, but we didn't fully register it because of Allie's shouting and the loud soundtrack. I paused the TV, waiting a minute, when another bang came to the door. I got up, curious who it could be. No one should have been coming to the door. I stuck my head out the living room, seeing a man stood at the door, and because I'm a teenage girl, home with only 2 other teenagers, I obviously didn't answer it, but stood by the doorway able to watch him to make sure he left. He didn't. He banged on the door rhythmically. Now, my friends and me are different people. I'm very paranoid and organized, whereas they are more relaxed, and they told me to sit back down and he'd leave. But then the door handle shook aggressively. "Call the fucking police!" I said quickly. My phone was upstairs in my room charging, so Allie called 999. She was speaking with the operator when everything seemed to slow down. The man had thrown a rock at the window in our door, and the key was in the lock, and to get it out, I'd have to go towards him. The police told us to find a place to hide with a lock, but no room had a lock. The lock in the bathroom had been broken since we moved in, but never had a reason to be fixed. So we ran out the living room into the kitchen. I had 2 ideas. 1, get a knife in case I had to defend myself, or at least just threaten him. 2, get out Storm. Storm was my dad's dog. He was a security dog and ex-police. So I grabbed his leash, got him out his dog cage, and clipped on the leash. Grabbing a kitchen knife, I went into the backyard with my friends. The man opened the door to the yard, where we were all stood. I tried to not look scared, but this man had to be about 40. Long, greasy blonde hair and blank blue eyes. They seemed to not have any emotions behind them, but his mouth was in a twisted grin. He was holding a hunter's knife. Storm was barking loudly at him, but the man didn't falter. I was hesitant to let Storm off because I didn't want Storm to get hurt. "Come closer and I'll let him off," I shouted at the man, who just kept walking. I backed away to stand next to my friends. "The second I let Storm off, we get the knife," I whispered, and my friends nodded. Allie still had the operator on the phone, who said anything we did could be classed as self-defense. "Go!" I ordered Storm, letting him off the leash. Storm lunged at the man, knocking him backwards, causing the knife to drop, but not too far away. Storm had a tight grip on his arm. I ran over, kicking the knife away from him. This went on for maybe 10 or 20 minutes, when the police came in and I got Storm away from the man. my dad was called and came straight home to make sure we were okay, which we were, luckily. We later found out that the man was a convicted sex offender who had moved in 2 streets down and saw me walking Storm and our other dog a lot. I'm so thankful we have Storm, and that my dad taught me how to deal with difficult and dangerous situations, because I don't know what would have happened if we just sat watching TV. A Strange Man Hunted Me Through a National Park by Valerian Jedi. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Like, not an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night I wake up and I hear something. Open my tent, and there's a guy sitting by where my fire had been outside my tent. Nothing particularly noteworthy about the guy, just a fairly regular looking dude, just sitting there a couple feet away from my tent. No bag or pack or anything with him. Just a guy. He saw me open the tent, his eyes got huge like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind fairly well after writing it off as just some odd occurrence. And a guy that was probably high or something and had somehow managed to set up camp coincidentally not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and 10-15 miles away in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night and started hearing noises that I got more and more convinced was a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no. I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, but they yelled, "Aim that way!" And, kind of spooked and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After like 15 minutes of me being very freaked out, and them talking and asking completely random questions from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So I shined my light that way again, and it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days, because there was no way he could have accidentally wound up in the same spot. As vast as that wilderness is, no possible way. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. I started to chase him, but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so stopped quickly after probably only 100 to 200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is specifically if he was following me. I decided the trip was very over first thing in the morning, and hiked back out over 3 days, constantly doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and occasionally hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it is to feel like I'm being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid potentially being murdered. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent. But by the time I mustered the courage to look, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first, in the distance, but slowly decided it sounded more like a human making animal calls. But could have actually been an animal. But I didn't see the guy again. But it really sounded like a person making howling noises. I literally almost cried when I got back to my car. The relief was so strong. To this day, probably the most terrifying experience I've ever had. I have no idea who that guy was or what his intentions were, and no way of getting an explanation. But I really can't articulate just what a terrifying few days that was. Something's Off with the New Guy by Goddamn Leader Cola. I was reading a story that reminded me of an event from over 20 years ago. The second half of 1998, I had taken a job as a security guard at a plant that made locks. Being a kid, I usually worked one of 3 shifts. 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 to 3:30 a.m., and 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30 to 3:30 shift was for extra coverage, so there were always 2 of us from there from 7:30 to midnight. It was a routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged anything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying a CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost painfully normal manner for 6 months. I worked, saved, bought a car, and planned to move. By late March of '99, I served my notice and prepared to head cross-country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot, a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working at all hours. At night, he was a shadow, working with myself and the other night guard, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights he worked with myself and Amira, a female guard who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin, who was about a decade older, was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing. There's a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and he didn't possess it. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he'd ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a little odd, laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I chalked it up to him being awkward. That wouldn't last. One night near the end of his first week, he went on rounds with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew something was wrong. Normally talkative, she would barely say a word. Not sure what had occurred, I waited until Calvin was gone to the restroom to ask. During their trip, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill, a portion of the plant that shut down at 6 p.m. There were usually no employees there after that time and no lights. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. She told me that she turned around only to find he was right on her. Startled, she backed against the grating at the end of the landing and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He flirted in a low voice, and when she mentioned his wedding band, he said it would be over soon. From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor detailing what had occurred. The next night came and went with no Calvin. I did the rounds while Amira stayed in the locked office. Same thing the night after. Then, on my second to last shift, I come in to find her freaking out. She found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. He had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned, parts of her body placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amira called the jail just to make sure they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he started the job. I Never Want to Meet My Best Friend Again by Shadows Over Mexico. This is a true story, and the trial is still ongoing. After binging about 12 hours straight of YouTube, readings of this subreddit has my mind in a dark place, though I can't entirely blame it. My mind goes here often. This happened 3 years ago, but requires some background. My best friend and I grew up in a sleepy, wannabe New Jersey, Central Florida town, and we were the outcasts. We had met in 6th grade when I'd overheard her talking to another classmate about bionicles, my 11-year-old self's passion. We became fast friends and soon were inseparable. Soon began the gauntlet of sleepovers, birthday parties, and family gatherings. We were practically siblings. She was the first person I'd come out to as bisexual, and in turn, I was the first person she'd told about being trans. Her home life was tumultuous, though I can't say mine was any better. We often had a habit of taking refuge at each other's houses. Like I said, we became like siblings. Her father was an alcoholic, strict, and prone to physical discipline. Her sister was a stuck-up girl who soon gravitated towards the hicks and jocks when we entered high school. And her mother was a pseudo-vegan, hippie love child held over from the 80s. When I was 23, herself 22 at the time, we had another long night of sleeping over in order to let her escape yet another fight with her mother. She had recently lost her job at Walmart, and I was going into my first shift at Taco Bell the next day. On the drive home the next morning, she excitedly told me that since she now had her own vehicle, she would be applying at pizza places that were in need of a driver. I was proud. It was the first time she'd hunted for a job on her own, as I'd usually been the one to coax her to apply where I was working. Not that she ever lasted very long. My first training day goes by quite well. My coworkers are friendly and try to get me to talk more. My manager likes to playfully embarrass me, a fat white guy, by trying to get me to talk hood to the other workers. Being a training day, it wasn't a very long shift, but I had been up early in anticipation, and this was my first day on the job in a few months. I got home around noon, informed some of my internet friends that my first day went well, and around 5 p.m. I started to bed down, drained from a good day. As I am prepared to lay in my bed, I get a Steam message. Her lamenting another fight with her mother and asking if she could come over. Now, I had started to grow a bit weary of the fights on their end. I had begun to repair my relationship with my family and a few friends, and I had given her advice many times on how to better approach things. In my infinite wisdom and eagerness to sleep, I left the message on read and drift off into slumber. Around 8 p.m., I am awakened by her bursting into my room in a panic. Having just been ripped from a dream, I am groggy and disoriented. I drag myself to the bathroom to relieve my bladder and come back to my room to find her rocking back and forth on my bed. It is at this time that I notice she is covered in blood. So I ask what happened. She informs me that she just saw someone murder her mother with a knife. My mind goes blank. In the deepest parts of my mind, alarm bells start ringing. Isn't the rocking back and forth a bit overdramatic? Why didn't she call the police? But this is my best friend. I've known her for over a decade, and we were the only two people in the world we could count on. I suppress it and go inform my sister and stepfather. My mother had passed the year prior, and it was roughly a month to the anniversary of her death. We were all in a dark place, antisocial as always. It was the only way we knew how to handle emotional issues. When I inform my family, they immediately go to the same place as I had, though they were far more vocal about it. I offer excuses I knew myself were flimsy and return to the room, phone in hand. I convinced her to call the police, and I could hear her explain the details over the phone. A man in a black ski mask. When the cops arrive, she swears up and down that it's most likely her father. They send cars over to check the crime scene and take her in for a statement. I ride with her in the back of the cop car over to the sheriff's office. It gets to be around 2 a.m. Her sister was brought in, as was her father. I have work the next morning and request to be taken home by a police officer. It takes a while to go to sleep that morning. The next day at work, I am quiet, until my manager asks me what has happened. I inform him, but decide to work the rest of my training shift. When I get home, my sister informs me. She had confessed. Her mother threatened to kick her out for not being able to find a job. And in a rage, she had taken a kitchen knife and stabbed her repeatedly. My mind froze like a bad computer, and I turned to face my monitor. I was in a Discord call at the time, and all I could weakly say is, "My best friend confessed to murdering her mother," before hanging up and laying on my bed. Her last trial was the 7th of this month. I don't know the results, though my grandmother tells me she took a plea deal for life in prison rather than the death penalty. Part of me wants to contest that, to demand that they take the death penalty for ridding the earth of such a peaceful and caring woman's shadow. A larger part of me is just glad she's being punished. Natalie, you were my best friend, my sister, and my platonic soulmate. But please, let's never meet again. Creepy Brother of My Mom's New Boyfriend by Bip Pip. Some backstory. My parents split when I was about 14. It wasn't a good breakup. My dad was an abusive drug addict, so when my mom left him, she was in a really bad place. Her and my older sister was in her 20s and in full-blown party mode, kept taking her to local bars since my mom was depressed. This led to my mom becoming an alcoholic, since my sister was well on her way to becoming one too. During one of these nights, she met a guy. I didn't know much about him, just that they met him and his brother at a bar, and now she was dating him. It went pretty fast, and my sister would flirt with the brother to get free food and drinks from him. Around this time, I was about 15, and this dude just seemed off. He was probably early 40s or so. He was always going on about my mom's dates with his brother. He just kind of hung around a lot. One day, my sister decided she wanted sushi, and called the brother up to take us because she knew he would pay. I did not want to go, but we didn't have food in the house, and I was hungry. We didn't have a sushi place in our town, so we had to drive to the city, which was about 30 minutes away. The entire ride, I just had this warning feeling in my stomach that kept telling me to get out of the car, that this was a bad idea. I was a giant ball of anxiety the whole 30 minutes. My sister sat in the front seat, completely oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, I kept catching him staring at me in the rearview mirror. Once we got to the restaurant, he sat himself directly across from me. He wanted to sit next to me, but I rushed to sit next to my sister instead. It was awkward, but my sister talked a lot, so I was able to kinda hide. Eventually, she got up to go to the bathroom, and then I was alone with him. Almost immediately, he asked if I had a boyfriend. I said, "No." "That's good," he said. "You're too good for high school boys. They're only after one thing." I just nodded, not knowing what to say. He then went on to ask if I liked Disneyland, and I said yes. He got excited and went on about how he would take me, but hotels were expensive, so we'd have to share a room. It would just be us, so my mom and his brother could be alone. He said my sister couldn't come, though, because he couldn't afford to pay for both of us to go. At this point, I was extremely uncomfortable. I just wanted my sister to come back. She finally did, and he switched to just talking to her. She didn't notice anything was wrong, or that he kept looking at me. Once he finished, he took us home and invited himself in. I went to my room, locked the door, and hid. At one point, someone tried to open my door. They stopped once they felt it was locked. My mom and her boyfriend came home around then. I tried talking to my sister, but she just brushed me off. They had invited us back to their house, and I wanted so badly to stay home, but they forced me to go. Almost immediately, my mom and her boyfriend went to the room, and left my sister and I with him. He got my sister drunk pretty fast and tried to get me to drink, but I kept refusing. It got to the point where my sister was almost blackout drunk, and I was freaking out because once she passed out, it would just be us. I started texting my brothers, hoping one of them would pick me up. Thank God my eldest brother responded. I told him what was happening and he came to get me. He showed up and told the guy that it was late and I had school, so he was taking me home. He tried to protest, but my brother was very firm about it. He loaded my sister in the car, texted my mom he was taking us home, and then we left. My brother didn't live with us since he was about 30 at the time, and he had his own family, so he didn't know what was going on. I told him the full story, and he got real quiet, and then waited till my mom got home. He told her off, shamed her for putting me in that situation, and told her that if it continued, he would move me into his house. My mom broke down then and told him she wanted to break up with her boyfriend because of his brother. Found out when I was older that he would sneak by the door to listen to them when they had sex. I think more happened, but my mom never talked about it more than that. She broke up with him, got a good job, and sobered up with the help of my brother. It took my sister a lot longer, but she eventually got her life together. So, the creepy brother of my mom's ex-boyfriend? Let's not meet again. Stalked at work until I turned 18. By Inside BG. I worked at a hardware store in high school. We had a number of fairly regular customers, but there was one man in their mid-30s that became a regular after I checked their items out one night. I noticed that I kept seeing them on my shift, and they would continually try to strike up awkward conversations with me / hold up the line until I told them I had to take care of my other customers. Our registers were in front of a large glass window, so anyone walking outside could see who was working. They eventually started to wait outside the window / tap on the glass to get my attention after leaving. I rode my bike to work, and getting off late at night started to terrify me. One night when I was working alone, they asked me if they could have my number, if I was 18. When I told them that I wasn't, they asked for my birthday, to which I replied some arbitrary date in the distant future. I told my boss about this interaction, and from then on, they made sure I never worked alone, and they would follow their ass any time they entered the store to the point where they stopped coming. The day of my fake birthday, or close to it, I couldn't remember the exact date I had given them, they came knocking on the glass again. It was busy and my boss wasn't around, so I tried to ignore them. I eventually noticed that the knocking had stopped, and I could only assume that they had made their way into the store. Very soon after, I am greeted by their face in front of my register. They hand me a plastic grocery bag and says, "Happy 18th birthday." I am embarrassed, so I take the bag and tell them to please leave. When my friend and I opened the bag after work, it contained 2 packages of fireworks and nothing else. I was somebody else's Let's Not Meet. By Something Wicked 97. This was pretty horrifying when it happened, for everyone involved. But enough time has gone by now that I can laugh about it. So here goes. I was in my second year of university. My flat was near a quiet road surrounded by woodland, so we'd occasionally see roe deer and other wildlife roaming around. We weren't that far from campus, but it was still pretty out of the way. One night, it must have been around 10 p.m., my housemate got home, came straight upstairs to my room, and told me a deer had been hit by a car and killed. It was lying practically in the middle of the road. There weren't many streetlights, so it posed a serious risk to any drivers who might not see it in the dark. It could flip up and go through somebody's windscreen, or cause them to swerve into a tree. We considered calling campus security to come and remove the deer, but we knew it would take them a while to get there, so we figured we might as well try and move it off the road and onto the pavement. I grabbed some heavy-duty plastic garbage bags, and my housemate brought a torch. When we got to the place where the deer was, I gingerly put my hand on her neck to check that she was definitely dead. I almost screamed when she suddenly came to life, flailing her legs out and thrashing and making the most god-awful groaning noise. It was like a horror movie jump scare. We were both very shaken, although thankfully out of kicking range. After that last outburst, the deer unfortunately did pass away. Although I think we were both secretly relieved that we didn't have to put her out of her misery ourselves. Killing a half-dead animal with a rock was very much not on my 2018 bucket list. No cars had come by yet, so between us we were able to wrap the deer in garbage bags and lift it. Once we had it up, it seemed stupid to just dump it there on the pavement when the woods were right there next to us. We decided to carry it a bit further out and leave it in a sheltered woodland area. I know how dumb it sounds now, but at the time it seemed perfectly sensible. You can probably guess what happened next. We'd been walking for a couple of minutes, the bag was leaking blood from the deer's hind leg, and it was generally just a pretty messy business. We were talking as we went, and I said something about how I hoped she hadn't suffered too much, and how we needed to find an out-of-the-way place to drop the corpse, etc. What we did not know is that not far away, just out of our line of sight, was a guy out for a late night smoke. I smelled the weed, but had no idea anyone else was around until we were on our way out of the woods again. At which point, we saw him walking ahead of us very fast, occasionally darting horrified glances over his shoulder. He was as white as a sheet. As we drew nearer, he broke into an outright run, and when we finally emerged onto the street, we saw him disappear around the corner. I can only imagine how freaked out he must have been. From his perspective, he'd just seen two people wandering through the woods after dark, dragging a heavy, bloody garbage bag, and discussing the most efficient way to dispose of a woman's body. We spent the next few days half expecting to receive some sort of call from security accusing us of murder, but nothing ever came of it. Maybe he went back to check for the body and realized what had happened. Or he was just too traumatized to report it. Either way, I'm pretty sure we gave that man the shock of his life. To the innocent weed-smoking guy in the woods, I am so sorry. I promise I'm not a murderer. My. You creatures are always so worried about what could potentially happen to you. It makes my hunting so much more difficult when you are so damned paranoid. Ah, well, a little hard work never hurt anyone. Well, except maybe in my case. If the stories made you cringe, cry, laugh, or shiver, please leave a like and let me know what you think down below. If the videos are just too terrifying to experience, I do also upload my stories in audio format to the SilverThreads podcast. If you want me to read a story, then send it to storiesforsilverthreads@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next time with another story.